Welcome to the Wing Space podcast, a place to take up space, a space for you to settle in, sit back, relax, and focus a little bit on health, wellness, faith, family, and this crazy thing called life.
This podcast is not a replacement for mental health treatment or professional health care. In case of crisis or emergency, please contact your local healthcare provider or dial 911.
Hey there, and welcome to the Wing Space podcast, a place to take up space. I'm here again with our nutritionist, Tracy Pritchard, for a continuation of our conversation about healthy habits as we are just around the corner into Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's and all of those holidays that end our year. So thanks so much for joining me again, Tracy. It's good to have you.
Hi, good to be here.
And so I'll direct our listeners to the episode that is the part one of this conversation, where we talked about some strategies for staying mindful with your healthy habits during the holiday season. And we alluded to it in the previous episode, but just this idea that sometimes it's really stressful to think about how we can stay focused on healthy habits and all of the things on top of throwing the holidays and the events and the to-do list and all of those just complicates the calendar. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about stress and then some of the other components that come along with that, like eating out and making healthy swaps and things like that. So I say we start with managing stress. How does that sound, Tracy?
Sounds good.
So, as joyful and as happy as the holiday seasons can be, we also know that it can be a really stressful time. Sometimes families together that aren't together during the rest of the year. We add on gift shopping. We add on the financial burden of not only the meals, but the gifts, and then unrealistic expectations. And I've talked with listeners and my own clients before about sometimes disappointment and frustration comes from not only unrealistic expectations, but also expectations that are inappropriately set, those that we place on other people without any reason to have done so. I would offer for our listeners to consider, acknowledge what your feelings are. If you're in a phase of grief, having lost a family member, or maybe even engaging in the holidays in a different way than you have in the past, acknowledge those feelings, name them, then express them and manage them appropriately. Of course, I'm all for counseling and for other professional services, but sometimes we need to find ways that we can manage the stress, whether it's through movement or journaling, meditation, prayer, deep breathing, all of those coping skills that may have previously worked. We need to continue to engage in those and maybe even ramp up the usage of them, so that we can engage in the healthy habits, which we talked about in the episode just prior to this. I was in a training a couple weeks ago, and one of the presenters said that for everything we say yes to, there are a series of things that we ultimately have to say no to. But the opposite is true as well, that when we learn to say no, it opens up opportunities for us to say yes to other things. And when I think about this from a nutrition perspective, I think about we might consider ourselves being restrictive or not being able to enjoy the holidays if we're saying no to certain things. But really, I think it gives us an opportunity to be a little bit more creative with what we're consuming and how we might make our plate look a little bit different than it typically does. So what do you think about the way that we can say no, but then open up opportunities when it comes to nutrition and health?
So, when you talk about the traditions, I remember certain foods that my mom made over the holidays, and they weren't necessarily foods that I want to keep making. And you know what? That's okay. She was known for spending all day in the kitchen making a 7-layer Jell-O. I don't recall us actually eating it, but I remember her being stressed out every year about making it. I mean, it looked really pretty. But I decided early on that was not going to be a tradition that I kept up, just because I didn't want the stress for something. I'm just a little more practical than that, I suppose. That being said, if there's a favorite Christmas cookie, she also made pizzelles. That's the Italian cookie. It's like a little waffle maker. They have just plain old white flour, eggs and sugar, little anise or something else. I do make those with my kids, and they remember doing that. But we've also added some other healthier versions of cookies or Christmas things, whether it's a version of an energy ball or some type of sweeter treat. Like there's such things like, a lot of fudge at the holidays. Well, guess what? Believe it or not, you can actually make a better fudge. Like if you're, instead of the traditional ingredients, if you're using things like pure maple syrup with almond milk and cocoa powder, like it can be done well. So there's always something there that you would actually want to eat than just either the process or the, high sugar treats. So that's where you can really, find some balance nutritionally. It's just finding new traditions. And it doesn't mean you have to get rid of the old. Maybe you keep some of the old and add some new ones in.
My mind immediately goes to our blog and our recipes that we share with our listeners and our community for healthier versions of fudge, because you're right. There are so many different things that we bake and we make during the holidays that certainly could be made just a smidge healthier, and then we still get to enjoy them so that we're not feeling the stress of, oh, I can't have that, right? But giving ourselves permission to have it in a different way, in a healthier way. And who knows, maybe you like the new healthier recipe even better than the one that's been, passed down for a couple generations.
Sure. Well, a lot of people are onto these like energy balls now. Like the traditional one might have like some oats and a peanut butter or almond butter and, flaxseed meal and chocolate chips. And those don't, when you look at those, you don't think Christmas, right? Like athletes have them, we have them year round. But there are endless versions of those that would look beautiful on a tray. I mean, there's a snickerdoodle version. You might be rolling it in a cocoa powder or dusting it with something else. That the base could be a nut butter or some dates, and different ones that on a tray you would think, wow, what a great, Christmas truffle spread. But in fact, they're really just versions of energy balls. In fact, there is a cookbook out there called Power Hungry, and it has endless versions of not just the energy balls, but like homemade versions of, like the Lara bars or Cliff bars or just other type of homemade granola bars or things like that are great, not just for bringing to parties, but for gifting. If you're looking for a hostess gift, you could make one of the recipes to give to somebody or buy them the book and give them the ingredients so that they can make those things later on. Which brings me to those little jars. I think they're a great idea. If you've ever received the mason jar with all the ingredients and the recipe to make chocolate chip cookies, again, you can do that in a healthier way. It could be the ingredients to make, for example, the triple brittle. That was one of our featured recipes early on. It's sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds and pure maple syrup. I can picture a mason jar with a little bottle of really good maple syrup hanging from it with a recipe, that you could gift instead of, the sugar, flour, and the traditional kind of cookie recipes.
Yeah, I love that idea about how to make it a little bit healthier and giving it to people as gifts too, because, that's, couple of things off the to-do list there. And obviously we know that not all of these options that we're giving to our listeners is something that we expect everyone to do, but we want you to just take a little nugget of information with you that's going to make things a little easier, less stressed for you, and healthier at the end of the day. We just want you to be healthy. And there's other episodes that you can listen to when we talk about stress and stress management. Obviously things about planning and being mindful and taking time for yourself. The reality, I think, for a lot of people, though, is there's a lot of group meals, there's a lot of eating out, there's a lot of extra indulgences that are not necessarily a part of day-to-day routines that people have. So I want to take a quick break, and then when we come back, I want to dive into this idea of eating out and how to be able to do so not just during the holidays, but specifically during the holidays when we add those extra indulgences. And so we'll be right back.
Are you a yogi in Southern Maryland looking for a place to practice on Thursday mornings? Look no further than Gentle Yoga with Lori Bruce at Hope and Healing in Leonardtown. A certified yoga therapist, Lori brings over 2 decades of yoga training and teaching to her classes. Gentle Yoga with Lori is suitable for all levels. Join us in person or tune in from home, as all Thursday morning classes will be available virtually. Space is limited, so reserve your spot today at loribruceyoga.com/schedule.
All right, thanks for joining us again. Welcome back to the podcast. Tracy and I are talking today about part 2 related to healthy habits. We've talked a little bit about stress management and how to gosh, just give ourselves a break. And that also needs to happen when we're talking about eating out, because whether it's, I would think, whether it's going to someone else's house and eating or whether we're going into a restaurant, there's a lot of different things that we can do in order to maintain healthy habits, especially during the holidays when we're eating outside of our home.
Sure. Well, when we're going out, especially like you said, the parties, I mean, that's really the thing that's different than the rest of the year because most people are probably still going to restaurants now and then. But really just being choosy about the foods you love. So if you go to a party and there's, we've talked about the store-bought desserts, or if there's, other things that really you normally wouldn't eat and you don't actually love, pass on those. Like take a look at what's available at the whole spread and then decide, hey, what's one or maybe two things that I really only see one time a year, or, you mentioned Aunt Sally, maybe she has a special thing that she only makes once a year and you only see her once a year. Like have that at that party, but then fill up your plate with, the veggie tray, the fruits, see if there's any lean proteins. Fortunately, with the boom of charcuterie boards, there's usually some type of, meats and cheese or olives, pickles, things like that that you can also fill up on that are quite tasty.
Well, and I think sometimes people think that they have to start at the beginning and work their way to the end of the line. And in terms of etiquette, that is the way that you would do so. But I would say don't be afraid to take a glance at everything that's on the spread first before you jump in line, because if you know that there is something at the end of the line that you want to indulge in, then maybe you don't grab some of the stuff at the beginning and take a look and see what's there, so you can really make a plate that is healthy and is filling and allows you to feel like you're really enjoying what's there.
Sure. And it might take that first party or work Christmas party, if it's on your lunch break or whatnot, or if you're a teacher in the teacher's lounge, to say, wow, that didn't go as well as I planned because I started at the beginning and my plate was overflowing. You know what? Just observe that and think, what could I have done differently? How could I do that a little better? And I will tell you, I mean, personally, if I'm at a party and I stand around the buffet, like a lot of times people put all their food on the island in their kitchen. If I stand around the island, I will eat and drink the entire time I'm standing there talking. But if I take my plate and I go walk away and sit down, I typically do not go back over to where the food is. So, I've been in the nutrition field for quite a while, and I come home sometimes and I say, gosh, I let myself get parked by the island and I just was eating and drinking all night. Okay, next time I need to be more deliberate and take my plate and walk away. So it's important to say, like, what kind of behaviors or habits do or don't work for you. I mean, we're all different. The other thing, please do not be like some of my kids will go to a party with a beautiful spread and they're too busy like having fun, which is great. But then they come home and say, I'm hungry, I didn't eat. Right? So they missed everything that was there. So that was kind of the opposite of someone who's, camping out at the island. So kind of just have a general plan. We talked about, parties are not often right at lunchtime or right at dinner time. If a party's at 7 p.m. and you normally eat dinner at 5, you might need to have a snack at 5 o'clock, right? So that you don't show up starving at the party and then just say, oh, the heck with it. I'm going to just have whatever I'm just going to have it all.
Tracy, you mentioned the idea of your kids being so busy at events sometimes that they don't eat. I have been known to say, eye contact with my children and my husband and say, this is dinner. You need to eat while we're here because I'm not cooking when we get home. Or this is lunch, right? Because there have been times where we get home and they're like, but we're hungry, we haven't had dinner. Okay, well, the meal that we were just invited to be a part of is our meal. And again, it's mindfulness and being aware and being intentional. Certainly the idea of not parking yourself around the island and making sure that you're not going completely empty and starving, because then we're just ravenous and we just kind of definitely overindulge.
Well, and it's not just about those sweet treats, or we keep talking about the festive or indulgences. It's even just portion, right? If you normally eat a certain amount of food and you eat double or triple, even if it's all generally, healthy food, that's still going to over time add up, right? Or just kind of change the way you feel. So being mindful of the portions. And if you're like, wow, I already put, some protein and I have some healthy fats and vegetables on my plate, but oh, wow, now I just saw that there's this. There's usually a lot of food at these parties. Don't be afraid to ask the host, sure, can I make a plate to take home? Because you don't have to eat it all right there. And it's fine to do that. Most people will be so thrilled that you ask because they don't know what to do with all the leftovers.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also helps us to be mindful that if we think we want to have a larger portion of something, but we've already been incredibly mindful to fill up with our plate with some veggies and some healthier options, then we can have a smaller portion of, I don't know, that sweet potato casserole, but then ask to take a little bit home and have it later so that we're not leaving there so regretful of all that we've consumed.
Sure. And I know a lot of this talk is about the decadent foods, but decadent drinks come out around the holidays too, whether it's, non-alcoholic drinks that are made with, fruit juices and punches that are just added sugar, or either alcohol or non-alcoholic eggnog. Pay attention to the labels. If you're not sure, maybe look it up. Sometimes a glass of eggnog can be like 500 calories, and it's a lot of added sugar. The whole term rethink your drink, like maybe just stick to wine or beer or something that is just a serving. A serving of wine is 5 ounces, and then just a standard, can or bottle of beer. And make sure you're having some water, some seltzer water in between each drink. The other thing is if you're drinking with your meal, that will also help regulate that intake, because too often people start drinking before they eat, and then that either leads to skipping their meal or eating too much, so just, again, being mindful about what you're consuming, both food and drinks.
Yeah, I'm hearing this over and over again, and I really want our listeners to hear it. Being mindful, we're not asking you to be rigid and plan everything, but just being mindful and making those deliberate and intentional choices. Any other thoughts about eating out or eating at other folks' houses in terms of tricks or tips for our listeners before we jump into our next topic, which I'm actually a little excited to hear about?
Well, not just when we say eating out, I think about people on the go doing their Christmas shopping or all those last minute errands. If you go out hungry or don't pack snacks, you're probably going to smell like the Cinnabon, right? Or something else at the mall or wherever you're at, or be more tempted to swing by fast food because it's quick and easy. And it would be just better to save not just the calories, but the indulgence for something at the party later on in the evening. So really just having a plan for all of that. And if you know you're going to be busy and that you have to eat out, think about what's on your route and where you can make, the most balanced choices.
Yeah, that's a really, really great idea. I think sometimes we end up shopping and it takes longer than we think because the crowds are bigger and the lines are longer. And then, we've rushed through a meal or something. And you're right, the smells of the food court are sometimes quite enticing. One of the other things that's interesting that can sometimes be stressful for people is we've talked a little bit in these last 2 episodes about making healthier swaps and taking that, family recipe and making some alternatives. And it can be difficult to consider how to do that without just changing the whole recipe, without, starting fresh and then it's a whole new, chocolate fudge, and then nobody realizes that this is the family recipe because it's completely different now. So to help our listeners take a little bit of stress off themselves when they want to make some healthy swaps, what might be some ways that people can make some healthier choices and modify those family recipes to make just a smidge of, just a step towards the right direction in terms of healthier choices?
Sure. Well, I will say the baking is probably more challenging than just normal cooking, because if you don't get the ratios correctly, things might not turn out the same, right? Like a bread or a cookie. So if you are going to do that, you might want to practice it before you actually make it for a holiday meal, if you're going to adjust just a couple things in a baking recipe. That being said, we said about adding new traditions. There are so many resources out there with, if you type in what it is and put healthy version, you will get a more nutrient dense version. But back to your question, where it's like some simple swaps, so you kind of keep it closer to the original. Even just something as simple as unsweetened beverages in things. For example, if you have a casserole or you're baking and it calls for milk, whole milk, 2% milk, you can swap that with things like unsweetened almond milk, whether it's vanilla or original, and save, a lot of grams of sugar, a lot of calories. Maybe you're like, well, it's not quite the same that way, but that would be one option, is look and say, would that work in this recipe? Certainly, if you go out to eat or you have a family tradition somewhere and you just always get something that's fried, I don't around here, whether it's a fried seafood thing or another tradition, simply switching from that fried version to something baked or broiled, same food, just prepared a little bit different, would be one of those simple swaps around the holidays. Or if you get fried all the time, maybe get fried once on your most favorite item, and then the other times go with the baked or broiled versions. Some of the other swaps too would be, baked potatoes, sweet potatoes, some of the steamed vegetables. Those don't always have to be part of a casserole. Those can just be standalone. They're really good by themselves. They do not have to be smothered in a cream sauce. I find it interesting that some people only eat sweet potatoes, at Thanksgiving or Christmas time. I mean, those are foods we can eat all year, but you can actually simplify the process by just eating them and not having, to do a big casserole. And part of that might be just using some different like herbs and spices when you prepare them. A lot of people will appreciate it. You'd be surprised because you're not the only one at your table that's looking for some, less rich foods if they're all prepared that way. I'd have to say one of my favorite substitutes, and I thought everybody was doing this, but is substituting, sour cream means you're already eating a dairy product. So assuming that you're not dairy free and you need a substitute, using plain Greek yogurt. So what that does is, aside from saving, you can do a whole or non-fat Greek yogurt, but those plain Greek yogurts are going to add a lot more protein to the dish, which will make it more satiating as well than the sour cream. So in all kinds of things, for decades, I've used the plain Greek yogurt instead of sour cream. And that's usually a swap that people say, I can do that. If you're not quite sure, you don't know what your family's going to say, you can go half and half. Use half of the regular sour cream that you use, but then the other half, use the plain Greek yogurt. And that also goes for like those colder, like mayonnaise-y salads. You can cut the mayonnaise in half and use the other half a plain Greek yogurt. And you can still have that creamy base, but kind of reduce the excess calories or excess fat and add the protein.
And honestly, sometimes if we don't tell them, they're not going to know the difference. I eat gluten-free, and most of the food that I prepare is gluten-free. And I just had this happen the other day. There was a cake, like an apple cake at an event, and my son went to go get a piece of it, and somebody said, oh, that's gluten-free, and then he didn't want to have any of it. Well, then about a week later, I baked it for an event, and I didn't make a comment about it gluten-free, and I'm pretty sure he ate about half of that apple cake because I didn't mention that it was gluten-free. So maybe we just don't tell them that we've swapped out the sour cream for the yogurt, or, regular milk, swap it out for some almond milk or something, because sometimes you really can't tell the difference unless you're told, and then psychologically you think it's totally different.
Absolutely. And sugar in recipes, like I said, it can be tougher with baking, but in general, the sugar and the oil in baking, if it calls for vegetable oil, you can absolutely, well, first of all, if you still want oil because you're convinced you need it for the moisture, you could just swap the vegetable oil for like an avocado oil for a better quality oil. But again, for years, if I see oil, I don't have vegetable oil, first of all, in my pantry, but I typically have an unsweetened applesauce. So I'll use the applesauce instead of the oil, and it totally works. Again, that could be recipe dependent if you're baking, but other people may actually use the applesauce or mashed bananas or other types of fruit purees instead of sugar to sweeten things. So you could try that if you're like, I'm not so sure. If a recipe calls for a cup of sugar, a lot of times you can cut that in half or leave it out altogether. Just experiment a little bit with less, and it's still going to work out.
Yeah, and I think, again, if we just don't tell people that we've messed with the recipe a little bit, they just don't know. There's a family recipe that my husband's family has that calls for a cup of sugar and a cup of brown sugar, and it's a delicious casserole. It's delicious. But for years now, I put half and half. And sometimes I don't even put the regular sugar. I just put some brown sugar because the other ingredients have their own sweetness to them, and you just don't need them. So of course now they're going to listen to this recipe or listen to this podcast and realize I've messed up the family recipe. But sometimes what we don't tell people, in terms of those healthy swaps, isn't a terrible thing.
Well, I know in the nutrition world, if I use somebody's recipe, I have to give them credit for it unless you change a couple things. So you can just say family recipe adapted by Jennifer. So then it's still the family recipe.
Well, and they're all adapted anyway because they're made gluten-free in their own way. So you're right. I can consider it an adaptation.
I love that you bring up gluten-free because we know that anyone with celiac needs to avoid all gluten. And there are a lot of other people who are avoiding gluten for other reasons, for gluten sensitivities, gluten intolerance. It's just a food rule that they've given themselves because they feel better without the gluten. So if people are willing, nothing wrong with, I would encourage you to bring a gluten-free and or dairy-free item to some of these parties and mark it. Like take an index card and put a GF for gluten-free and a DF for dairy-free. So people that need to follow those type of diets will appreciate that because they'll know if someone made the effort to put that sign that they made the effort to make it that way. But it doesn't have to mean just buying like a gluten-free processed food or junk food. If you're swapping out plain white flour that spikes everybody's blood sugar, which is gluten, for like an almond meal, or you're using a different type of gluten-free flour, that recipe may actually be a healthier recipe for everyone. Again, just because it's gluten-free or dairy-free doesn't mean that there's not added sugar or other things in it. But a lot of times someone who's following that might be following more of a paleo-ish type of diet plan or nutrition plan, and it's going to be a healthier version. So this is a great time to play around with those types of desserts, side dishes, main dishes. They're out there. Lots of resources for those nowadays.
Yeah, and as someone who has to have a special diet, I am always so happy when I go somewhere and somebody says, hey, just so you know, this is gluten-free or that's gluten-free. We had a family gathering a couple weeks ago and my cousin told me everything except the hot dog buns are gluten-free. And I just thought that was amazing that she had done that. And she bought gluten-free ones because we had, Italian sausages. So I thought it was great that, it was easy enough to satisfy the whole family and everything was easy enough to do gluten-free. So it's really nice, especially in the holidays when sometimes those of us with special diets don't get to enjoy as much as others.
Well, I will say, I think a lot of our listeners are in the Southern Maryland area-ish, correct? There's other things around. I'm just going to put the plug out just for food allergies in general, like alpha-gal. So those are people that had a tick bite, and they shouldn't eat beef, pork, lamb, or dairy products, right? So there's that dairy-free. Like if it's a dessert, there's likely not mammal in it. There could be with gelatin. But I was looking for turkey meatballs yesterday, and of course, VJs didn't have them. So I had to get the ones with, pork and other things. And I thought, oh no, I hope there's nobody with alpha-gal because I was hoping to bring a version that any meat eater could eat. But the benefit was on the bag, and I looked at the ingredients, they're gluten-free and dairy-free. So while I can't put, they're not beef-free or mammal-free, but on the little index card, I can serve it with gluten-free, dairy-free. So again, just being aware of those things. And if you're making something that came from a friend who gave it to you that's following gluten-free or dairy-free, those being the big ones at the holidays, please do mark it because more people will be likely to eat it then.
I'm hearing another episode coming out of this conversation with regards to, eating more specific special diets and also helping to accommodate others. So I'm thinking more on that to come in our next season, very likely. So, for our listeners, we hope that you've gotten some good information that will help you going into the holiday season, make your own choices, kind of manage your stress, go to these events and outings and be able to still enjoy and indulge, but make healthy choices. Any last minute thoughts, Tracy, for our listeners?
I will say, yes, just like we talked about Halloween and getting those treats out, have some boundaries that once the holidays are over, and maybe it's December 26th for you, maybe it's January 2nd, get all the indulgences out. If you have certain cookies that you love and you make every year, but you just eat them all day long, set some boundaries with, hey, I'm going to make these cookies and I'm going to enjoy them on Christmas Day, not the week before and the week after. And, if you're a baker at heart, share your goodies, right? Like make all the cookies you want, but then give them away to your neighbors, to your coworkers. Don't just keep them laying around, especially if if they're there, I'm going to eat them.
That's a really great idea. I'm thinking of, buying the little holiday containers and filling them up and giving them as, little hostess gifts when you go to these different events, or as gifts for friends and family that you just don't know what to get them, but a homemade treat is always a nice gift to have. So to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, we would love to hear your thoughts around holiday habits and planning. If you've got some healthy swaps, let us have those recipes. We're always excited to see what you're doing. You can email me, jennifer@hopehealingtherapy.com. You can also send us a message through our socials on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks so much for joining, and we hope you have a great day.